Now, another common similarity in adolescent friendships is in terms of preferences for media and leisure activity. So, in other words, you like the same stuff, you like to do the same things. Adolescent friends tend to like the same kind of music. They tend to have interest in the same kind of clothes. They tend to just have the same interests. I don't know how else to put it. Now, this is also the basis of every single movie ever made about the adolescent and teen years with really clear groups or cliques in a high school. So you have the jocks or the athletes or the goth kids or the preppy kids or the stoners or the nerds. Of course, adolescents want to be friends with those people who are similar to them in terms of what they're interested in. If you're not interested in the same stuff, it's not likely you're going to be good friends. Just looking at something as simple as music, somebody who is a devoted fan of country music is likely to be more interested in becoming friends with somebody else who loves country music than somebody who thinks country music is horrible and they prefer heavy metal thrash. If an adolescent likes to play computer games during their leisure time and another prefers to be really active and play sports, the two are unlikely to become good friends. Now, this doesn't mean they're going to have conflict, but it's not likely they're going to be good friends. Now, a third common similarity among adolescent friends is risky activities, which needs a bit of an explanation. Because the fact is that some things that adolescents do are inherently risky, whether they realize it or not. And during adolescence, your friends will usually be similar to you in terms of drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes or weed, in terms of using other drugs. Your friends are likely to be similar to you, even in the way you drive. So if you usually drive really fast or are a really cautious driver, your friends will be similar to you in terms of behaviors. So if you party a lot, if you shoplift, if how you handle conflict, so if you get into a lot of fights, all of these are risky behaviors. Yes, even underage drinking, which tends not to really be viewed in that manner. So some young people drink on a regular basis, pretty much every single weekend. Some drink every once in a while, maybe every few months, and some don't drink at all. Think of your high school. Some like to party all the time while others didn't. Now, you might not have considered these things to be risky behavior at the time, and I don't think most young people realize the inherent degree of risk in certain typical adolescent behaviors. We're just having fun, it's not risky. But the fact is, young people tend to choose friends who resemble themselves in terms of willingness to participate and who view this in the same manner. And the last criteria that usually determines how adolescents become friends with somebody might surprise you, because adolescence is a time when ethnic boundaries and friendships often become stronger. So during childhood, friendships are more likely to be inter-ethnic. But as children enter adolescence, this tends to decline. Now, common sense would say this is greatly affected by where a person lives. But with that in mind, why does this occur? Well, one theory is that moving from childhood to adolescence, as you grow up, you become more aware of tension or conflict or just a feeling of being uncomfortable between different ethnic groups. So maybe they pay more attention to what they say on the news or what's written on social media. And because they pay more attention to all of this, and also pay more attention to what their parents are saying, what their parents' attitude is, it will have an effect on them. So if a young person grows up in a Pakistani family and they become more aware that they are expected to hang around only with other Pakistanis and to eventually only date other Pakistanis, without even being explicitly told, on some level, you know that is your parents' expectation, what they prefer. Ethnic similarity in friendship at this stage also reflects ethnic segregation in schools and neighborhoods. And again, this is a direct effect of where your parents choose to live. Parents may choose to live in a neighborhood in part because they know it's an ethnic enclave that matches their own ethnicity. They may openly want their kids growing up with people who are similar to them. And then The other kids their children meet in their schools and neighborhoods tend to be from the same ethnic group, and this is the group that their possible friends come from. Another way of saying this in a much more academic manner is that ethnic segregation in adolescents' friendships reflect the patterns of the society they live in, and ethnic segregation tends to exist in most societies in some way. So knowing all this, knowing that young people tend to selectively determine who to be friends with, whether they realize they're doing it or not, friendships during adolescence provide the young person quite a few things. Thomas Berndt specified 4 specific things that adolescents gain from their friendship. Their friends provide them advice, provide them guidance with the rest of their life in solving personal problems. They give them somebody they can talk to, somebody they can lean on. And this is referred to as informational support. This is where that need to be similar really comes into play. Having friends that are similar creates a feeling, rightly so, that your friends will be able to understand what you're going through and relate to it. And again, this is also why adults can never be a true part of an adolescent's peer group or friendship group, because they are dissimilar from adolescents based purely on their age. Something else that friends provide each other in adolescence is actual tangible help. Homework, lending things to each other. Lending clothes was a huge thing when I was in high school. Helping each other actually do something, maybe helping them look after a brother or sister, maybe lending them money. And this is referred to as instrumental support. I can really relate to something else that an adolescent gains from their friendships: companionship support. Having somebody there for you, just as you are there for them when it comes to attending or participating in something. Something as simple as walking into the cafeteria used to send me into deep anxiety. So going somewhere public like a dance or the mall or a restaurant, some kind of sporting event, a party. For me, going somewhere along with my group of friends was necessary, because not to do so would have sent me into an absolute tizzy. So having people to rely on to be with me, whether it was a daily thing at school, like going into the cafeteria, or somewhere else, was a huge support, and that's companionship support. And finally, something else that adolescents gain from their friends is esteem support. So their friends are there for them when things go well, but they're also there for them when things don't go well and they've failed in some way. Academically, a fight with parents, a romantic relationship comes to the end, which you think is the absolute end of the world, and you'll never be with anybody again in your life, and you say this at 15. Now, what about at the end of adolescence into emerging adulthood? Friendship in emerging adulthood takes on a new significance for a few reasons. One of which, at least in Western society, that's often when a person leaves home for the first time. So in emerging adulthood, you don't have this daily physical presence of parents, and the attachment to friends and what you do with your friends becomes even more important, even more significant. Most emerging adults are not married and do not live common law. So that, combined with the lack of immediate family with them all the time, provides a real incentive to develop close friendships and to rely on those friendships quite a bit. This is, in fact, usually put forth as one of the main advantages of living in residence your first year of college or university, that it's going to allow making friends easier. You're going to meet more people. You're going to have the social support of more people around you all the time. So intimacy, that emotional bond, is a key component of friendship during emerging adulthood. And emerging adults tend to rely heavily on their friends for support and social activities, but only if they're not in a romantic relationship. The importance of friendship tends to decline as romantic relationships develop in emerging adulthood. For most people, friends are more important in the early part of emerging adulthood But when an enduring romantic relationship develops, they become less important. In addition to becoming more important in emerging adulthood, another way that friendships change is that emerging adults are more likely than adolescents to have other sex friendships. It isn't that you don't have them in high school. In fact, for myself, one of my best friends in high school was male. But other sex friendships are much more likely to occur in emerging adulthood. So let's kind of shift gears here for a second and step back and look at the big picture and look at what is known as youth culture. There has been extensive research on youth culture, and this is something I personally find really interesting. I'm not sure why. Maybe because my own adolescent years were so uncomfortable for me and I always felt like I was trying to fit in. And maybe because every generation, I've realized, seems to feel like they're the first to experience the basic fundamental parts of adolescence and youth culture. But I'm now old enough to truly see elements of youth culture come around a second time. I get such a kick out of seeing little things, such as with trends. The last few years, neon clothing has made a bit of a comeback, and I wore it when I was in grade 8 in the mid 80s. Ankle boots have made a comeback, and I remember wearing them in the 80s. And even banana clips and scrunchies. I just about fell over when I first realized they were coming back in. Because when they were in the first time, once they went out, they were considered one of the most horrible fashion accessories ever. Now, just the idea of there even being a separate identifiable youth culture necessarily means recognizing that young people are just that, a separate group as a whole. They're separate from children and they're separate from adults with their own distinct culture. And this hasn't always been around. The Roaring Twenties is the first time that an easily identifiable youth culture became a widespread social phenomenon. Yes, youth culture in the 20s would have affected those in adolescence, but it was mainly young people at the end of adolescence and their late teens and into the 20s. Now, there was a lot of change occurring in the 20s for youth, socially speaking, that we might not recognize as such because to us it's just the norm for our time. But youth of the 20s were the first generation to really experience self-indulgence and self-gratification and being decadent at a pretty young age. Keep in mind, this is right after World War II, so society as a whole was ready to enjoy life, to enjoy the life they had fought for. And this self-indulgence was kind of considered like a reward, especially in regards to sexual behavior. Because up until then, sexual norms of society were still pretty restrictive, especially for girls, who were still largely taught the importance of maintaining their virginity until marriage. Now, this meant not only no sexual intercourse before marriage, but no sexual contact of any kind, not even kissing until the right man appeared. So dating as we know it still didn't exist. Instead, the focus was on courting. And the difference between dating and courting is done with the intention of contemplating marriage. But in the 20s, with the youth culture that emerged, this changed. So for example, petting parties became popular. And if you don't know what petting is, that means fooling around. And these parties, the purpose of them was to essentially grab somebody you were attracted to and fool around with them. A new kind of music became popular known as jazz. And this is why the 20s are sometimes referred to as the jazz age. And if you're not familiar with jazz, it truly does have a completely different sound to it. At the time, which was considered by many as specifically stimulating sexual desire. And in this way, jazz has something in common with rock and roll when it first emerged in the 50s. With rock and roll, it was something that youth loved and adults thought was scandalous and actually downright dangerous because it encouraged young people to move in an inappropriate way. And this is how jazz was viewed, with young people loving it and many adults considering it dangerous. So as stated in the textbook, a newspaper in Cincinnati said, The music is sensuous, the embracing of partners, the female only half dressed, is absolutely indecent. And the motions, they are such as may not be described with any respect for propriety in a family newspaper. Just imagine. Now, something else that reflected this newfound self-indulgence of a more relaxed sexual norm was women's clothing. Hemlines began to rise, and yes, the hemlines you see in these pictures are considered high. We wouldn't consider them high or short, but for the time it was very daring to have the hemline of a skirt any higher than 7 inches off the ground. And not only that, but believe it or not, young girls were wearing some at knee length, which was absolutely shocking. And they would wear nylons the same color as their skin, done with the purpose of drawing attention to their legs, to show off their legs, which made it even worse as far as the adults were concerned. And young girls were wearing their hair far shorter than normal in a style known as a bob, instead of keeping it long and pinned up like they should to be proper. And, wait for it, I hope you're sitting down, some young girls were even wearing makeup. Can you imagine? The 1920s was when cosmetics first really became mass-produced and widely used. So young girls were able to use lipstick, for example, or mascara. They would put blush on their cheeks to make them pinker. They started shaping their eyebrows. So before I go any further, isn't it really kind of funny and ironic that there's always a generation gap in terms of what is and is not appropriate for young women? Now, the exact details of the generation gap might be different, but it's always there. This was also the 20s when a particular vocabulary first developed that was usually associated with and maintained by young people, what we would call slang. Now, you might look at this and think a lot of this is just silly, but at the time it was considered important. So why? Why did this occur? Not only why, but why then? Why didn't the first distinctive youth culture emerge in 1850? What was it about the 1920s that caused, or at least allowed, the first recognizable youth culture to develop? Well, as I already said, there was the historical influence of World War I, which was supposed to be the war to end all wars, when millions of Americans and Canadians in their late teens and 20s had gone to Europe as part of the war effort. Now, as I already said, after the war, society as a whole, particularly those who had been overseas, felt it was time to live it up after so much hardship. But in addition to this, think about what the daily lived experience of World War I and what that was like. Going overseas meant that many young people were removed from the narrow structures of socialization in their family and in their community. They were exposed to other influences, so that when they returned home, they resisted being restrained much more than they did before the war. Partly because, and I don't mean this sarcastically, trying to tell somebody who has literally participated in a war what to do is kind of ridiculous, and partly because they were exposed to less restrained influences during the war. So World War I had a lot to do with this distinctive youth culture emerging. Another reason this occurred in the 20s was Sigmund Freud, whose ideas first became really widely known in the 20s. Generally speaking, these were ideas about how having an active sex life was very, very healthy, and not having an active sex life was unhealthy. Not only would it be enjoyable, obviously, but having an active sex life would actually maintain your mental health, and to not do so may cause psychological damage. So talk about an important reasoning for young people, or people of any age for that matter, to not be so restricted sexually. And a third reason a distinctive youth culture first emerged in the 20s, but not before, has to do with the changing status of women. As of the year 1920, women in the US were allowed to vote. They were recognized as independent persons under the law. something that occurred that we don't really acknowledge now how significant it was. Maybe to realize how significant it was, how would you feel if somebody told you that you didn't have the right to vote? And although nothing like it is now in the 1920s, more women in the 20s who were not yet married did start to work outside the home. So they would be exposed to influences outside the home. And then finally, one other factor that contributed to the rise of youth culture at this time that I don't think any of us would think of on our own, which might make you giggle a bit, was the increased availability of cars. In 1919, only 10% of Americans had cars with tops. But by 1927, this figure had climbed to 83%. And as simple as it sounds, this is important because the wider availability of cars with tops meant that young people had a way of getting away from their parents and, frankly, a place to go to fool around. Now, not all people take part in youth culture just because it exists, and this was no less true in the 1920s. Still remember talking to one of my high school English teachers, Mrs. Desjardins. This would have been in the late 80s, and we were talking about the hippie movement of the 60s because she had been in her senior years of high school in the late 60s when it was at its peak. And I said something to the effect, well, that must have been so awesome, that must have been so wonderful. And she pointed out to me that the majority of young people were not involved in the hippie movement, that it was actually a small section of her age group. And it was the same during the 1920s. Most young people continued to do what was expected of them, to abide by traditional rules of morality and behavior. But at the same time, we had this segment that really embraced this youth culture. So just on the surface, I hope you can see some of the similarities between youth culture in the 20s and those that developed in the decades after. Just on the surface, the idea that young people had their own ideas about clothing. Not only what was worn, but how it was worn. So it was still a dress, but it was worn shorter. In the 1940s, some males would wear what is known as a zoot suit with a longer suit jacket. In the 1950s, greasers still wore t-shirts, but they rolled up the sleeves. Young people in a youth culture have ideas about hairstyles. In the 20s, girls wore it in a bob. In the 50s, boys who were greasers wore it with Brill cream and styled it in a sort of wavy twist. In the 60s, some guys grew their hair out. Sometimes other features of appearance become part of the culture, like makeup. And there seems to be a slang that comes and goes. You can Google slang terms for each decade to see how these phrases became popular. And of course, there's a certain kind of music associated with the culture. But every youth culture has certain identifiable underlying criteria that are a bit more serious than just what we see on the surface. So what exactly qualifies a group of young people to be considered a youth culture?